We look at Maui's giant fishhook and how it could be used as a weapon.
This is the Kitsune clan, a group of sword enthusiasts who like cosplay, reenactment, and historical martial arts. If you have similar interests, feel welcomed.
We have looked already at quite some fantasy or pop culture weapons, but not so much at stuff from Disney. Well, of course, we have, for example, looked at the Keyblade, but I mean the classical Disney stuff. And one thing that came to my mind when I recently rewatched the movie was Maui's giant fish hook from Moana slash Vaiana. You might know in Germany and parts of Europe, Moana is called Vaiana. Interested in the case behind that? Check the internet, it will tell you. So, this is not a Doctor Who episode, although you could get the impression, and it's not about Batman's Riddler, it's about a giant fish hook. And of course, first step, we need to get a prop to experiment with it. If you order a toy version of this hook, you will get something like this here. And you can see it's not very large. I am not Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or his cartoon alter ego, but this is definitely too small to experiment with it. Luckily, this can act as a kind of template. Using a light source, we can simply enlarge the outline of this toy and cut out the shape of the fishhook in cardboard as a first step. Then as a next step in Styrodur and add some more layers, glue everything together with a ton of hot glue. I think I used up 10 sticks of hot glue to get everything together. And then wrap everything in duct tape. And in this case, I used white and black duct tape to have the feeling of the giant fishhook. Now we have a prop we can play around. And it's immediately recognizable. This is not what you traditionally consider a weapon. So we are in the same realm here as with the Kingdom Hearts Keyblades. This thing seems not to be optimized for fighting, but it's used for fighting. So the question is, how can we optimize the use of this thing as a weapon? As Maui is using it in the movie, I think I've recognized a certain pattern. To my impression, he strikes not with the hook side, so with the open side, but with the back side. And I also think this is the mechanically safer side, not to break it that easily. And when you swing around this large thing, it also wants to orient in this way. So I think he's doing things right here. The diameter of the weapon is of course quite large and it's not so easy to grip it. It reminds me a bit on some classical Japanese stuff where you use a giant log to fight against a sword. There are obscure videos about these techniques online and they have been discussed by a lot of people. And I think you can get the impression why I make this comparison. We have no distinct blade, we have no distinct tip that we can really use for striking, so it comes down to a bludgeon weapon. There is a certain indent at the tip that can be used for defense, so for pushing away another weapon. It's not easy to use the hook opening for anything because the opening is rather narrow, so it will not be easy to fit something in. We could argue that all this material just adds up to the weight and not have a shape advantage, but just a weight advantage. Overall, I found it most useful to swing the thing because it's heavy and cumbersome, so it's not so easy to stop. You can use some of the moves that you would use with the sword, so the transitions between different strikes, but it's much more tricky because your grip is rather loose and one hand is basically pushing in one direction and the other one is pulling, and by this you can generate quite some force with a certain degree of control. So against a sword, this thing is basically useless. It's much too slow, it has a bit more reach, but due to the higher speed, it's easy for the person wielding the sword to cut the hands. Wait, evade, and cut the hands. There's no real chance to deal with that in a proper way with the fishhook. Against the axe, the fishhook is interesting because the mechanics of both are comparable in the sense of that the weight is distributed far toward the tip. The axe has the advantage that it can really cut and that makes it more dangerous. The problem of the hook is simply if you don't move it properly and just hold it out, somebody can grip it and by that block it. Still, with the change in pace, the axe is slower than the sword. The fishhook can somehow do something against the axe. Most interesting and a bit surprising for me was that the fishhook is relatively usable against a polearm. And in the cultural context of overall Polynesian culture, in which this whole setting of Vaiana Moana is set, this somehow does make sense because the spear will be a common weapon, or if they use their paddles as weapons, these are basically polearms. And this hook can really shine a bit. It could even be that this weapon would work also against several polearms, similar to a Zweihander, so that it can push away several polearms. And with this indent in the tip, it's even possible to control a polearm to a certain degree. And we even made it happen that here the hook really hooked something, namely the polearm, and could be used to take control over the polearm. That means, although it's seemingly rather useless against the sword, against the polearm it can shine to a certain degree. Another weapon I urgently wanted to test because of the Disney connection is, of course, to see how the fishhook fares against a Keyblade. And I already said these two things seem not to be optimized weapons, but are used for weapons, so this comparison was interesting for me. I'm not sure whether Maui with his fishhook appears in Kingdom Hearts. That's something that you might tell me. Overall, the Keyblade is in a lot of aspects here more similar to the axe and also to a certain degree to the sword, because it acts faster and it can outmaneuver the fishhook quite a bit, but it also cannot really cut, so this makes it a bit of a disadvantage. But the Keyblade we are using here at least has quite some tips and points that could be used to attack the opponent. Overall, Maui's fishhook is for sure not a optimized weapon and maybe also not really inspired by a real weapon, but it's not completely out of the scope of the mechanics of this thing to be used as a weapon. This is an interesting approach to these things, and I think it's also a bit of a Disney approach to have objects that are not real weapons being used to defend against attackers. And this way of thinking is, in my view, what makes this interesting, because that's the same way of thinking when we are in an emergency situation. And so I think even hardcore martial artists can get something from this way of thinking. Also, concerning acceptance of carrying weapon-like objects at cons and festivals and stuff like that, these things have something to offer, because if you carry around a giant axe, you might get into trouble in certain types of festivals, but if you carry such a giant fishhook, for example, this might well be accepted, and it can just act as an example for other possibilities. Overall, I am quite happy with the giant fishhook, especially with the performance against the polearms. So I think we might really experiment in a future video with polearm formations, including the fishhook. I hope this gave you some inspiration, and I hope to see you around next time.